Welcome, everyone. It's a real pleasure to moderate this session. John Alderdice has a long list of qualifications and positions, and I'm not going to read that for you. All I can tell you is that before I met John about 13, 14 years ago, I had a very different perception of a member of the House of Lords. John corrected that perception. He's a very thoughtful person who comments and follows international developments in a very thoughtful way. We are both members of the International Dialogue Initiative. It has been a pleasure for me to learn from John and other members. IDI is a network of more than 20 professionals from different backgrounds who try to understand societal and political developments through a psychologically informed discussion. And that thinking and that framework will also guide our discussion today. So we are going to look at de-globalization, but within a psychologically and also globally informed framework. And I'm sure we'll all learn a lot from John's comments in the process. So as a way of introducing the topic, I'm sure all of you can imagine what de-globalization is. I mean, basically, globalization has been shaping our modern world in the past few decades. We all immediately think about trade when we think about globalization, but obviously it's a lot more. It's created a lot of interdependencies, not just in trade, but also in the flow of knowledge, flow of expertise, human resources, and so on. But interestingly, highlighted through the COVID-19 crisis, but even before, we are witnessing a process of de-globalization. We are witnessing national governments focusing more and more on becoming independent, basically ridding themselves from some of these interdependencies that became very challenging during the recent crisis. So the question is, where are we going with this de-globalization? What are the longer lasting impacts of this de-globalization? What does it mean for international businesses? What does it mean for leaders of international businesses? And I'm sure that it will be a very, very fruitful and constructive discussion. So with that introduction, John, thank you very much for giving us your time. I want to just start by you giving us your big picture analysis of the current situation, both in terms of how you have viewed the current pandemic within your way of looking at international developments, and also how you see this de-globalization process that we are witnessing.
Well, Bijan, thank you very much indeed for your welcome. It's a great pleasure to be working alongside yourself, and I look forward to this conversation and our continued conversations. We're at a very difficult and unpredictable place, I think, in global affairs. And there are two or three things to say about it. The first is to emphasize your observation just at the end of your introductory comments there, that the problems that we're facing had started before the pandemic. The whole question of globalization over a period of time, and then something pulling it back, de-globalization, if you like, is not something that was created by the pandemic, but it may well have been emphasized, exacerbated by the pandemic. And I think that's absolutely true. In terms of getting an overall sense of how we might look at these things, I think it's very important also to understand psychological time and space. I mean, history is important. If we're going to understand where we are now and where we might go to, although that's not predictable, but if we're going to understand anything about it, we also need to understand where we've come from. And we also need to understand that we see things differently depending on where we are in the world. I, as an individual, see things differently from people who live as separate human beings in my community, but I see things even more differently than people who are living in other communities. And some of that is because of different culture, but some of it is simply one sees things from different perspectives. The third element which we bring particularly as human beings to this, apart from time and space, is what we might call consciousness, or the capacity to reflect, to think about things, to imagine yourself in a situation in the past or in the future, and to think and speculate about that. Now, if we think about history, you know, the world has always operated with lots of relationships across boundaries and across space. We sometimes think of globalization as a very modern phenomenon. And in some senses, it is, at least in its degree, because of the movement and communication that has become possible by technological development, whether it's communications technology or whether it's capacity to travel very quickly in ships, trains, but of course more recently in airplanes. And that has speeded up enormously the kind of communication, the travel, the trade that there can be. There's no doubt that's greater than it was before, which also gives us less time to think about changes that take place. The 24-hour news cycle has meant that when I was more actively involved in public life, as a politician, you were reacting all the time to things that were coming in, to questions, to phone calls, to more recently to emails and to Twitter and so on, without having very much time to think about it. And so you're reacting rather than reflecting. And sometimes you just have to do that, but it is good if you can pull back and think a little bit about things. But historically, there have been major inflection points when hugely significant things happen. If we look back over the last 100 years, after the end of the First World War, where of course there was another pandemic, the 1918 to 1920 influenza pandemic, in which tens of millions of people died across the world changed dramatically. Politics changed, the economy changed, communism came into the lead in many important parts of the world. Then, of course, through the period of depression, we moved into the Second World War, which did many things, many of them very destructive. It also completed the ending of empire, increased the strength of the United States, the development of the Soviet Union and the Cold War. That changed the perspective of things enormously. It changed the intellectual climate very considerably. And then when we came through to the end of the 1970s and into the 1980s, all of that began to change again, to a point where people like Fukuyama began to say, we're at the end of history. We've proceeded through all of these other ways of thinking and looking at things, and we've now come to liberal democracy. That's what's going to be the way of running the world from now on. Politically, it's going to be the way. Economically, it's going to be the way. Free markets, free democracies, free capacity for people to think. Well, of course, it didn't last for very long because all sorts of disruptions began to take place. And I think, who knows, but I think that what we're seeing now is not what one might call the shaking up of the system, because what happens there, it's like a kaleidoscope. You shake it up and then it settles back down into something a little bit different, but not terribly so. But every now and again, maybe every few hundred years, there's a substantial shake-up which does not go back down into the place it was in before. 500 years ago, we had the Reformation. We had disruptive technology, printing. We had a sense of deep disenchantment, of corruption amongst the elites. And we had the sense that knowledge and understanding was moving beyond what had been the case before. And we've got all of those things now. We've got disruptive technologies to the power of 10. We have a profound sense, particularly since the 2008 financial crisis, of corruption and a distaste for those in authority. And we also have the emergence of very different ways of thinking about things than was the case before. So maybe it's not just a question of the system being shaken up, but as we know from systemic thinking, it coming back down into some form of that same system. But perhaps it's actually being shaken up so that in a way it settles into a different kind of system, not one that can be followed through in a linear way from where we were before to where we might be going to, but something that's much more complex in its functioning than that.
Would you also argue that within that systemic, let's call it transformation, also our value systems are changing? Can we see that? Or are we going to all forget about some of these challenges that we faced and then just go back to the same sort of materialistic value system that we had before the pandemic? Do you think value systems are adjusting themselves as well?
It's certainly being shaken up. And there are a number of things here. The first is that, of course, when you shake up any system and people feel uncertain, anxious, even frightened, maybe terrified, you then look for some kind of set of meanings which you have understood from the past. So there will be people who will look to previous ways of thinking about things, whether those are religious or philosophical or whatever, to give them some kind of meaning structure to think about. So that's why you get the rise of religious fundamentalism, but also people returning to old ideas that we associated with socialism and communism of the past. You find, for example, in the United States of America, somebody like Bernie Sanders coming on. In the UK, it was Jeremy Corbyn. People looking to say, oh, well, in the past, there was something that we should return to. It wasn't tried hard enough. We must do that. And of course, as I say, religious fundamentalism is another example. Nationalism is another kind of example. The problem is that these all emerged over a period of time to give understanding and meaning to the situation before. And there are some fundamental things that have changed in the last 2 or 3 generations. One of them is that there are now global threats in a way that didn't exist before. We talked about globalization. You mentioned the economy, globalization of ideas, of course, but there are global threats which did not exist before. For example, since 1945, we now know that we have the capacity to destroy all life on the planet in a nuclear war. Before that, no matter how terrible a war was, and there were some very terrible wars, in the end, the world was able to recover itself, the population recovered itself, and we didn't end all human life on the planet. We now know that that's a possibility. The second thing is the environmental crisis. Again, no matter what we did, the wider environment as a system settled itself back down, coped with whatever we threw at it. Now we know that that is not necessarily the case, that if we don't find ourselves doing what is necessary, the environment may change in irreversible ways that may make life difficult, if not impossible, for human beings on the planet. So as we begin to struggle with these questions of morality, principles, ethics, understanding, meaning, we're doing so in a context that is unprecedented in human experience. And it's hard to believe that that doesn't require us to make really quite fundamental and challenging changes, which will take substantial time. And I'm not talking about a few weeks or a month or two. These things, we're going to be struggling with them for quite some time as we try to survive and try to settle down. And many of the ways that we thought would work from, for example, the late 1700s with liberty, equality, fraternity, the great revolutionary themes of freedom, equality amongst people and community. We're now beginning to wonder, how much do these work? Some would say we need to get back to them even more energetically than before, and others are saying, well, wait a minute, equality, for example, is simply never going to be possible. We should look for fairness, but equality is not going to be, we can't make life the same for people who are fundamentally different. And indeed, an understanding that there is, as Isaiah Berlin pointed out, there is no common understanding of what is the good, because things that are good can be in direct conflict with other things that are good. So he suggested pluralism. Others are saying, no, we just have to divide the world between the people who see things in this way and the people who see things in a different way.
Thank you. I think one of those binaries that we have right now and where we probably don't have a clear answer is this binary between economic welfare and sort of economic well-being of our societies and the public health. I mean, you see that with the struggle that every single government has in terms of when to restart economic activity and how long can one government or one nation give top priority to public health. From a political point of view, political leaders' point of view, but also maybe gradually shifting towards also the perspective of business leaders, how do you frame this binary? And is there a guideline on how especially business leaders should look at this? Because I can imagine the anxiety among businesses that cannot operate in the current situation. And the question is, how do we evaluate the situation? How do we assess the situation?
Well, when we get into these very frightening challenges, the appearance of COVID-19, new virus, we don't really understand it fully. We desperately want to find some kind of solution or some kind of way of protecting ourselves. And so this enormous move towards lockdown, closing off countries and communities to try to protect ourselves. And as you say, it creates huge, unprecedented economic problems. We've never had a global shutdown like this before. So we really don't even know how to reverse it. I think that what's important is once you begin to get people through the first stages of profound panic, where they look for certainty of lockdown. Lockdown means lockdown. It means close yourself off, don't engage with anybody else. For the first while, you need to do that. But after a little while, I think it's important to introduce some degree of complexity in thinking. Now, if you simply start to make the argument that says, look, there's an economic side to this as well as a health side to this, then people say, you see, you're one of the people that doesn't really care about human beings. You just care about money. So that introduction of that as a conversation immediately does not necessarily go well. But I think you've got to introduce complexity in some other kind of way. For example, to say to people, well, look, we've got a health crisis. There's no question about that. But the health crisis is not just about COVID. One of the huge problems in all of the developed countries is that because all the attention has gone on the pandemic and the virus, and all the focus has been on making sure that we have health capacity to deal with that surge, all sorts of other health problems have been completely neglected. We have lots of people who are going to die of cancer because the cancer treatments that are available, where available, are not being made available because all the focus is on COVID. Many of the people who would have been coming along, even with things like heart attacks and strokes, are not coming along to hospitals, partly because the facilities are not entirely as available, but also because they're so frightened that they might get COVID, that they're actually going to end up dying with something else. And of course, that's not even to look at the massive mental health problems that are caused by the lockdown itself, as well as all the other sorts of elements. Now, I think if it's possible for us to begin a public conversation that looks at the complexity of the problem that we're dealing with, that it's not just a binary choice between healthcare on the one hand or economic health on the other hand, but rather to say, addressing our health is more than addressing COVID. It's more than addressing physical health. It's really genuinely very complex. There isn't an easy answer. The thing that may be an answer today may not be an answer tomorrow as we move through this whole process. So let's try to have some conversations about how we deal with all of this, understanding too, of course, that from a health point of view, when businesses go down, when people are not employed, when the tax base shrinks, you simply do not have the resources to enable people to get on with their lives and indeed to pay for healthcare systems. So let's try to help people to get away from this binary choice between physical health and economic health, and help people to understand that as human beings, individually and in community, all these complex aspects of the system need to be able to work together. And that requires conversation rather than simply sloganizing.
Thank you. You mentioned complexity. I know that you use complexity theory in assessing and analyzing some of the processes in your work. Can you share some insight with our audience, especially with business leaders who may need to use this complexity science to resolve some of their strategic questions? Can you just share some of your own experience with this?
One of the challenges that I used to find in my original profession, which was psychiatry, was that when someone would come along with a problem and you would try to help them to look at all the different elements that came together to create their problem in their internal life, in their relationships, in the society they lived in, and so on. They would say, yeah, doctor, but what is the real problem? What's really at the back of all of this? And when I went into politics, it was really very similar. You would try to look at the complexity of what was going on, not just that it was complicated, but that it was complex. Everything impacted on everything else. People would say, yes, but the real issue is, and they would come up with whatever their pet theory was. But the truth is that when you simplify things down, you actually lose some of the significant data that helps you to understand things. Let me give you a very simple example. Water is some atoms of hydrogen and some atoms of oxygen put together in a very particular way, H2O, 2 of hydrogen, 1 of oxygen. You can understand everything there is to know about hydrogen and everything there is to know about oxygen, but it'll not tell you anything about water. You can understand everything about a molecule of water, but it won't tell you anything about wetness, because that requires a very large number of them to be together, and to be together in a certain concentration, because if they're at a temperature that's too low, it will be ice and you won't get a sense of wetness, for example. So when you simplify things down, when you try to get to the root of it, as it were, in people's minds, by simplifying everything, by analyzing it in a very linear way, you don't actually get to the truth of it. You get to some elements which are important to understand, but you actually lose the truth because the truth is incorporated in complexity. When you bring things together, new properties emerge that did not exist before. You and I have enjoyed engaging with each other in International Dialogue Initiative. When we come together, each of us brings our understandings, but when we have a conversation, some new things emerge that I didn't know before I came and that you didn't know before you came, but they emerge in the conversation. So when we are in a world where people and communities are fragmenting, separating off from each other, whether it's business or politics or whatever, we are going to lose some of that complexity and that understanding. And there are those politically who want to separate off, who want the purity of their country or the return to history of how that country was. And actually, they're not going to get that. And they're going to be disappointing people, and they're selling them a false prospectus. And those of us that understand that have to try to ensure that we do not lose that complexity. One of the things is maintaining international relationships and international connections. Maintaining those sort of networks is part of the maintenance of complexity, because things emerge from that simply are not possible previously. And this isn't just a social science question. Actually, this understanding of complexity came from the nuclear physicists who began to understand that even in terms of mathematics, it didn't work. And certainly if you were beginning to do something economically and technologically like adjusting the traffic that was going in and out of a city and what were the best routes for it to go in and out of, and we all use our GPS now, it required complexity science rather than linear understanding formulae to help people understand what was happening and how to get the best outcome from it. So these are very practical things, not just theoretical, and they're not just social science issues, they're very practical issues that involve fundamental science and technology. And if we are beginning to lose that, we are really beginning to slide back, and we need to try to make sure we don't slide back too much.
Thank you. Very, very insightful. What I want to ask our participants now is to gradually put in your questions into the chat room. I will then put those questions to John in a few minutes. There are obviously so many topics, especially with the explanations about complexity. And one thing that came to my mind was that maybe part of the process of de-globalization, which you also underlined started before COVID-19, has to do with this complexity. Basically, we have gone very deep into a process without really understanding all of its complexities, and that also explains why you have so many sort of nationalistic and protectionistic policies in various countries, even within the EU. And that for me was one of the most interesting findings in the current pandemic, is that even a more established structure like the European Union could not really respond as a community to this pandemic. In fact, a recent survey showed that the majority of the European Union citizens are disappointed and believe that the European Union could have done more in the current crisis. Now, from obviously a British perspective, especially based on the decision of Brexit, how do you see the European Union exercise? I agree with you that it would be a mistake to disconnect, but how does it look from the British perspective, how the EU managed the crisis?
One of the things to say is that there is not a British perspective. One of the very striking things is how deeply divided British society has become over the last 3 or 4 years on this very question. The one rather suspects that it has become a surrogate for a whole lot of other questions as well. I mean, I come from a background and perspective where I'm pro-European and for the European project. And part of that is a personality kind of thing, and the family I grew up in and so on. And part of it was because I came from a divided society in Northern Ireland, which was able to find the model of the European project, the coming together of old enemies, France, Germany, and others, to find a new way of living and working together where war was unthinkable. The details of the model were really helpful to us in Northern Ireland. So I was very strongly supportive of it. But I became increasingly unhappy with what was happening, because the whole project had been about building a new set of relationships that left behind The old disturbed historic relationships that had immersed European countries in war time after time, generation after generation. And as people worked on building new sets of relationships that used the instruments of economic cooperation, pooling of sovereignty, working together on the European and then on the global stage, the development of the euro, all of these very useful instruments gradually began to become the whole purpose of the exercise. But the purpose of the exercise was not just developing a free market. It wasn't about giving a seat at the top table of world affairs for the leaders of small European countries. It was about a peace process. And once people forgot that that's what it was about, and they began to focus on the bureaucracy, regulation, the achievement of these secondary instruments, actually, the arguments started to build up again. And what we've now found is that some of the deep cultural, political, and even religious differences of Europe, which we thought were left behind, are now re-emerging. If you look at the splits, for example, between Northern European states, Scandinavia, Germany, the Netherlands, and so on, and Southern states, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and so on, that is the split that took place 500 years ago with the Reformation, where most of the south of Europe went with the Catholic Church and most of the north went with the Protestant reformers. Or if you look at the splits that are taking place between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, that takes us back not 500 years, but 1,000 years to the great split within Christendom. So whenever things aren't holding together and they start sliding back, they slide back to old fault lines. And that's one of the dangerous positions we're in at the moment. And some of that, as you quite rightly suggest, is perhaps because we moved forward so quickly on things like the expansion of the European Union, the European community, the different countries, and also some of the political, cultural changes that people wanted to take place very quickly, within a few years. Other people began to say, wait a minute, this is shaking things up, this is changing my country, changing my culture, changing my attitude too quickly. I can't cope with all of that. I want to pull back. And so rather than a gradual development that had understood the complexity of the relationships and the need to focus on national and international relationships within Europe, moving ahead too quickly may well have scared the horses, as it were, and created this split and this pulling back. And I hope, but I am rather fearful, I hope that we can repair that before too much damage is done.
I hope so too. I think it's an important institution. Can you name any global political or business leaders whom you consider to be effective in this challenging environment? Any examples of leadership?
Well, I think actually some of the examples that are rather encouraging come from smaller countries. The Prime Minister of New Zealand, for example, is a very bright, capable young woman with a family who is operating in politics and in her community, and has succeeded in persuading her country to take a very thoughtful and, as it turned out, very effective approach, not just to the pandemic. If that was the only thing, you would say, well, she was fortunate. New Zealand is a way out, remote from everybody, so they were safe, and almost quarantined anyway. But if you look back at how she dealt, for example, with the earthquake, or if you look at how the terrorist attack in Christchurch was responded, she has also shown a very constructive way of approaching that. So I think some of the larger countries that would have held themselves up as the people to be admired maybe need to think a little bit about how some smaller countries and communities have handled, not because they have all the answers. And of course, it's true they're also dealing with a simpler situation because they've got a smaller community. But maybe we need to recognize that centralizing everything doesn't necessarily work as well, even within the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland seem to be managing their affairs better than England. Maybe that's because England has become too centralized. Local government has been many of its powers have been taken away over the last number of years, since the time of Margaret Thatcher, for example. So I guess one of the thoughts in my mind is maybe we can look not just to smaller countries that have been successful in managing these things, but also whether or not centralizing everything is actually the best way of governing even larger countries.
True. I learned in another IDI dialogue with two of our members, there are two ways of trying to address challenges like COVID-19. One way is to become anxious and tense because we don't know the answers. And an anxious leader will obviously create anxiety in societies. But the other way, and I think the New Zealand Prime Minister is a good example of that, the other way is to say, here are the problems, here are the facts, let's see what we can do about it. And try, as you said, engage in a dialogue to find the answers. And I think it's probably better to talk about the methodology. And I think the methodology of dialogue will definitely be more useful. So another question, John, could de-globalization also be the beginning of a rebalancing of economic priorities? And in a way, COVID being an accelerant in the process?
I think it's a really important question, this. And I think the answer is could it be? Yes, it could. Our old friend Vamik Volkan, who of course was the one who set up the International Dialogue Initiative, which was focused very much on dealing with conflict, often talked about peace processes being more like playing an accordion rather than riding a bicycle. So they didn't move smoothly from war to peace. There was a pulling together and then, difficulty arose, and then a pulling together and then a difficulty arose, but gradually you moved forward. And I think it may be something similar here. If we can find ways of understanding the problems and the challenges, appreciating the social movements that we've described, but nevertheless helping to engage with each other in a positive and constructive way, looking at the changes that do need to take place. As I mentioned one, a governmental change, the appreciation that local governance is important and shouldn't be looked at as less important and significant than national and international governance structure. Another issue is the relative involvement of governments in stability and welfare for people. For the last 20 and more years, we've been moving away from what would have been regarded as a social democratic engagement of government in various aspects of society, focusing much more on free trade, on the economy, on freedom for business to just get on with itself. Well, there have been certain successes there, but there have also been serious difficulties that have emerged. The difference between, for example, the pay of the top chief executive of a big corporation and some of the people at the bottom has been such a multiple that it has become quite unacceptable to many people. So there are various ways in which this COVID challenge and the other challenges we've spoken about may well help us to reset things. One of the difficulties about it is, however, we don't really have a very clear intellectual model of what we might be moving towards. Whether we look at the changes in the early part of the 20th century or the early parts of the 16th century, most of the reformers of those times had a relatively clear idea of where they were trying to move to. At the moment, I don't think we've got quite that sense. I don't get the sense that there are some visionaries out there who have really clarified what the new model might be, how we might be moving to it. We're not quite at that point yet. I very much hope we will get to that point, but there's quite a lot of thinking and intellectual struggle that needs to take place to get there. And maybe this kind of conversation is part of that struggle.
A related question is, what are some of the lessons learned in successful dialogue processes? Maybe one or two examples from your experience where dialogue played an important role, and obviously we have the Northern Ireland peace process, but also what lessons you learned or you can pass on to others.
One of the things is how profoundly we are affected by our own history and culture. We have, all of us as individuals and communities, we have a way not just of thinking about the world, but a way of being in the world, a way of engaging emotionally as well as intellectually. And for us, that's just normality. You kind of think, well, how can anybody think anything different from this? You know, whether it's your sense of morality or your way of judging or your confidence or whatever. You think, well, that's the way it is. But it's not. It's yours. And that's not to any way invalidated. But it is to say that there are other people who you don't just see things in a different way, but engage in a very different way. For example, I used to find that we would find great differences in the way of thinking of people from a Protestant Unionist background and people from a Catholic Irish nationalist background. So we would get an agreement on the agenda, for example, and we'd start working through it. And we get to item 1 and item 2, and then we get to item 3, and the Catholic nationalists would say something like, well, you know, to understand item 3, we really need to understand some of the issues further down the agenda in items 5 and 6. And the Protestant Unionists would say, We spent ages and ages reaching the agreement on this agenda, and you want to just tear it up as soon as we've started it. You're not serious about getting peace. You're not serious about solving these problems. You're not even prepared to go along with the very simple agreement we had on the agenda. And the Catholic nationalists, no, we're trying to get a rounded, a global understanding of the challenges and the problems. And the Protestants said, no, that's not what you're up to at all. And the truth was that both of them saw how to address problems quite differently. They genuinely found it very difficult to understand how the other felt and thought about things because of their experience, their history, their culture, their politics, their religion, their background, and so on. And so the job for someone like me was, in a sense, to try to understand, not just from my own perspective, but from their perspectives, where they were coming from, why they saw things in that way, and how could we engage in a relationship, in a conversation that would give respect to these different ways of working, so that out of that could come new ways of understanding things that didn't toss to the side their way of looking at things, but valued it, validated, and took us forward to a new way of understanding things, where you could say, now there's a new way that we could do this, which builds on the old ways, but brings them together into something that's new and actually quite positive and interesting for everybody to be involved in. But don't expect that when people feel that, they'll immediately be entirely positive, because some people will be positive, and some, as we said earlier on, will be frightened for all sorts of reasons. And you have to be aware that things won't move forward in a simple linear trajectory. You'll be moving back and forward. You'll be encouraging some people. You'll be discouraging certain kinds of behavior. It's about relationships, as anybody who engages with other people, and perhaps particularly in bringing up a family, as you and Barry have done, knows very well that it's that kind of process.
I think one task for us, John, is to promote VAMIC's accordion model more in the world, to develop this understanding for the dynamics of these processes. I will have one last question to benefit from your great geopolitical analysis and understanding. One of the sort of consequences of the various crises we have had in the past few years seems to be a new sort of Cold War between the US and China. The timing of it and how this whole thing has played into the political framing of the COVID-19 crisis, to the point that US President Trump still calls it the Chinese virus. How do you see that development and its impact on global business, on globalization and de-globalization? Are you concerned about a sort of new geopolitical Cold War that could affect all countries in the world? Your insight would be greatly appreciated, John.
I'm extremely worried about it, Bijan. I'm slightly hesitant to use the term Cold War, first of all, because it tends to suggest that this is a recurrence of the East-West United States-USSR split that we had for some decades in the 20th century. I don't think it's going to be like that, not least because it's not just a question of the United States and China. Russia is also a very important player in this situation. And we now have two of the three presidents, and that's two of the P5 of the United Nations, who are effectively going to be presidents for life. And we don't know what's going to happen with Donald Trump, but I have no doubt that he would like to put himself into that position. And so we now have at the most senior levels of world affairs in the Permanent Five of the Security Council of the United Nations, a complete blockage. Nothing can be agreed of any substance there on almost any issue. This is extremely dangerous. Second thing to say is Cold War is not a good description, because in cyberspace, it's already a hot war. If what is happening in cyberspace at the moment was happening on land, or sea, or air, or in space, it would be described as a world war. It would be a global conflict. And that's the other element of globalization. The globalization of conflict is something that, as the other globalizations shrink, the globalization of conflict gets greater and even more dangerous. I'm extremely worried about it. I don't think it's at all clear how we can get over that particular problem. The United Nations is simply a table where different countries can meet with each other. It's not an organization that can solve these problems if those who are participants don't want to solve them, but want to continue with the struggle and conflict. We're in a very dangerous place there. And one of the struggles and questions for me is how individuals, civil society, smaller countries, international business organizations, charitable organizations, and work with countries and nation states as well as the international organization to find a new way forward, not to just pull us back to the way we were before. That won't work. We have an old saying in Ireland, you can't reboil your cabbage. You can't just go back and do it all over again and make it right. It will have to be different. And finding a new and better way is what we need to do. And we need to do it soon, or what you've described as a Cold War could end up as a hot and very destructive war indeed.
Thank you, John. I usually like to end on an optimistic note, but I think there was enough optimism in this discussion.
Let me say one thing on that front, Bijan.
Sure.
And it's this. Of course, what I've described is dangerous and difficult, but real paradigmatic shifts of understandings from where we are to something completely new in governance, in meaning, in understanding, in politics, in economics, only comes in situations of profound crisis. Apart from that, we just have incremental improvements. Major paradigmatic shifts only happen when we have to face up to huge crises. So the upside of all of this is this and the next 2 generations have the challenge and capacity for completely new ways of thinking about things. And that is the positive thing we have to work towards.
That's a great point to end the discussion on. I want to thank you, John. You have helped us understand the complexities and also develop some frameworks, especially the concept of using dialogue and understanding the diverse dynamics. Thank you so much for your insight, for your time. And I hope that we will all contribute to finding the right sort of remedies, how to come out of the current crisis and how to develop a much more stable and positive way forward. Thank you very much, John.